All right, so what we'll go ahead and do is we'll go ahead and get started. So, hey to everyone on Facebook, welcome to this week's, our bi-monthly meeting of CRE 101. Always great to see everyone and make sure just check in and see how everyone's doing. Today we have Paul Grisanti, who's actually my broker with the Grisanti Group. He has a ton of experience in the commercial zoning process, which we'll get into in a little bit, but so I think it's going to be a really insightful meeting. So yeah, welcome, Paul. Excited to have you.
Thank you.
All right. So just to start off, what we generally do is we have some preset questions that I'm going to ask you and kind of walk through, and then at the end we'll open it up to Q&A. And what I'll be doing is we'll be checking the chat box in Zoom, and then also for those of you guys who are on Facebook, just feel free to comment on the live link, and I will be sure to ask the questions at the end of the meeting. So just generally speaking, when we start off these meetings, we like to ask the person that comes in to tell us a little bit about themselves, like what got them into the career field that they're in, and then yeah, just kind of give us a brief overview of who you are and what you do.
All right. Well, I was in the restaurant business for about 30 years before I jumped into commercial real estate, and I got into the restaurant business. It was a family business. I had really when I was in high school and college, I really didn't, high school, I had no intention of getting in the restaurant business, but I did because my, dad started a restaurant and I was there to help him out. And so I always thought I wanted to do something else. And when I was in the restaurant, we had people from all over the world actually come to the restaurant. So I got to talk to a lot of professionals, doctors, attorneys, engineers, real estate brokers, et cetera, et cetera. And I decided when I wanted to make a career change at age 48, which is pretty late in life for most people to make a career change, I decided to get into real estate. I like the legal aspects of real estate. My intent when I was in high school was to become a lawyer, and that never happened. So I like the aspect of real estate because it has legal issues, lots of contracts, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought I would have a good mind for that. Plus, it did not require another 4 or 6 years of schooling to get into it, like a law degree or something of that nature. So jumped into commercial real estate with both feet, and it was a tough couple of years at first, but then it worked out. And it worked out well for me. So anyway, that's my background.
That's awesome. And then also, which we'll get into during this meeting, I mean, you do have some experience as far as the zoning process is concerned because you served on Bozer for a while as well, right? Can you tell us a little bit about how you got that opportunity?
Well, first I want to say when I first got into real estate, I just happened to do a lot of land deals for whatever reason. And a lot of the deals required rezoning because somebody would see a piece of land, or I'd string a couple of residential properties on a major artery. The very first place I started to work was Taylorsville Road because that was kind of my home base. That's where the restaurant was, on Taylorsville Road. So I had a lot of listings on Taylorsville Road. And so I started doing a couple on Taylorsville Road. Then people would call me and we'd string houses together and put it up for sale, rezoning potential or commercial potential. And we did several of those deals. So I learned a little bit about the zoning process there. And to learn more about it, I attended a meeting one night. I just went to a random zoning hearing out at the Southwest Government Center. And so I got up and asked several questions because I knew nothing about it, just wanted to educate myself. And one of the people on the board recognized, or at least she thought, that I asked some really good questions. So she recommended me to the mayor to be put on the Board of Zoning Adjustment. So I accepted the appointment, and that was after 2 years in real estate. I sat on that board for 8 years, and then I eventually resigned. I could have stayed longer, but I resigned because it took a lot of time. And so I wanted to, I thought 8 years was enough, but I learned a lot about the process, and it helped me tremendously. I wasn't on the the zoning board, but I was on the board of zoning adjustment. So zoning adjustment is slightly different, and but I learned a lot about the zoning process through that experience.
That's great. And we'll get into that process a little bit later. But so to start off, I mean, one of the big things we are probably all thinking is how does the zoning process work? So let's maybe walk through the process from you see a piece of property that you think could be good for X use, and then maybe that particular piece of property isn't zoned the way you need it to be zoned. How do you get from point A to point B?
Well, the first thing is to have an idea, just like you said. You see a piece of property that's uniquely located, it's got good visibility, good access for retail perhaps, or it has other attributes. If it's for maybe industrial, it's in a good area next to roads. So every property is unique. That's one thing you have to remember about property, is every property is unique. And you can have a property that's, 500 yards away from another property and the price will be 3 times as much just because of the unique value of it. But on the zoning process, to stick to the zoning process, you have to have an idea what you want to do with that property that you see as unique for a certain purpose. The very first thing you'd have to do is file a pre-application with the Planning Commission. And with the pre-application, they'll give you some advice. Again, I'm not an attorney, so I want everybody to know that. This is just from my experience. This is what I know. Could be slightly different. Technical details could be a little bit different, but you'd file a pre-application with the zoning board. Then you have to send out a notice to the neighborhood, all the first and second tier property owners, to the property that you want to get rezoned. So if there's like 10 properties around it that touch the property, you have to notify them, and then you got to notify the properties that touch the property that touch the property. So it's first and second tier property owners get notified, and then you usually have a neighborhood meeting in the neighborhood where the property is affected. So it's easy for the people in the neighborhood and the surrounding neighbors to get to the meetings, usually held in the evening. And so what one would do typically at those meetings, you would have an engineer there and an attorney there. The attorney would handle the legal aspects of it. The engineer would handle the technical aspects of it. And you just go over the plan and talk to the people in the neighborhood, tell them what you want to do and try to get feedback. Some properties are non-controversial. Sometimes nobody even shows up at a neighborhood meeting. If they don't care, usually when people don't care if something happens, they don't show up. If they are opposed, they will show up. So typically in the zoning process, the loudest voices are the ones that are against the project, typically, because they don't want it. But the ones that want it or don't care don't show up a lot of times. So after the neighborhood meeting, then you'd get feedback. You might adjust your plan a little bit. Then you file a formal application. So the first thing you do with the zoning board or the planning and zoning is to file a pre-app, then have a neighborhood meeting, then file a formal application. And when the formal application is filed, then the zoning board will send it out to all the various agencies. I think there's 11 agencies that have to comment on it. Think about it. You've got the MSD, they're worried about drainage. You have the traffic commission, they're worried about traffic to the site. You have the fire department, they're worried about how we're going to get in case there's a fire. Will our trucks make it down the road? Is the access good for the trucks? So you have all these various agencies that weigh in, and they usually have several weeks to get back with comments. Then the planning commission might ask you to revise your plan to comply with all these. And then, so after all that's done, you may have to revise your plan, submit a revised plan, or hone it down. And then when you're ready for the actual public hearing that goes before the zoning board, then that's a public open hearing. Everybody that was notified about the neighborhood hearing and any other interested party can show up at that public hearing. Nowadays, it's a little different because we're using Zoom, but before it used to be at down at 6th and Jefferson, the old jailhouse is where they had these hearings. So everybody would show up, and the staff person who talks about all the technical aspects of the case would make a presentation. They make their presentation as to what the applicant wants and why, and if it complies with all their standards. Then the applicant would get up and make a presentation and kind of go over in a little more detail what the staff person does. Then you'd have parties, comments from anybody that wants to talk, or actually the opposition. There might be somebody opposed that's represented by an attorney, and they have a chance to get up. Then you have public comments. Anybody in the public can get up and say they're either for it or against it. And they usually organize it. Everybody that's in forward, everybody that's for the process or for the zoning gets up and speaks. Then you have people that are neither one way or the other. They just want to make comments. They might say, I'm not for it or against it, but I do want to point out. Then they might point out something that's relevant. And then you have the people that are opposed to it. And then the person that's applying can get up and respond to the people that are opposed to it. And then usually the board goes in, business session, open session. Everybody can hear what they're talking about, but they don't take any more comments after that. And then they vote whether they should, this zoning should be allowed. It's important to note that the actual staff member has a recommendation. It either complies with all the guidelines or it does not. And they're going to say, we recommend this be zoned, or we recommend that it not be zoned based on this. Now, a lot of times the staff, well, all the time, the staff goes right by the book. They're tied into what the book says and what the guidelines say. Sometimes it makes no sense because things change over time, but they have to go by the book. Then those that might want to go against what the planning staff level says, they're either for it or against it. Usually if they say they're against it, then you have a reason to refute that and state your changes, why this should be allowed. And then the zoning board discusses it in open session. They discuss it and then they vote. And after the zoning, and I'm giving you a really high level, it takes a lot longer than this to do it, but they vote. And let's say they get a positive vote where it gets voted to be rezoned. Then from that point, it has to go to Metro Council. So Metro Council has the final say, and Metro Council, the actual the representative for that area will influence the rest of the council, because people in other parts of the county don't care about zoning in your part of the county. So if you really want the zoning, you indicate that to the rest of the 25 council members, please vote for this. But they have a first reading at the council, a first reading of the rezoning, and then there's the discussion. And then there is a month later, they have a vote, either vote for or against. And then there's always somebody that might want to file a lawsuit if they don't like if it got zoned or if it didn't get zoned. There's another appeal process. So the basic process is you have an idea, you have a pre-application, you have a neighborhood meeting, formal application, zoning board, then it goes to Metro Council, then it can be appealed through legal process of a lawsuit. So those are all the stages in a nutshell.
Definitely. And so, I mean, it is a pretty long and drawn out process. And I mean, typically, and obviously this obviously ranges in timelines, but can you give us an idea of what the typical timeline is for a rezoning? In particular, when I'm sure it's different if it's straightforward versus like very controversial.
If it's a non-controversial rezoning, it could probably be done in 4 months, because every time you submit, there's a timeline. There's only certain days of the week you could submit. And then after the submittal, then they send out like to the agencies, and the agencies have a couple of weeks to respond. And then you have to set it up for another time that you could submit again. So it's not a fast process, but it's really fast for a very non-controversial zoning is about 4 months. One that's controversial, where you have a lot of neighborhood input, a lot of back and forth, it could take a year, sometimes 2 years, just depending on how many times you have to go back and revise the plan, how many, you might have more than one neighborhood meeting. Just if there's a lot of opposition, you might try to quell the neighbors' angst by revising your plan. So, you know, it could take a year or 2 years to get through that, but hopefully you get through it in a year. And then there could be a court process whereby a lawsuit could be filed, just like we are right now with Topgolf. That went through all the process. It got approved. Now there's a lawsuit. So it's pending. And I don't know if that's in the Supreme Court, appellate court, or the regular court. It's in one of the jurisdictions. And so it's pending at this point. There's been a lawsuit filed. A very small group of people do not want that. So they're the ones filing the lawsuit, trying to hold that process up.
That makes sense. Yeah. And so throughout this particular process, what are some of the costs that need to be considered as you're going through the zoning process? Because I mean, you're, like you were mentioning earlier, you may need an attorney, you may need an engineer. Like, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes. I would say that if you're going through the zoning process, at minimum, you need an engineer and an attorney and an architect. And the reason is an engineer will show what you're going to do, what the site's going to look like, what the building, where the building sits on the property, how you're going to handle the drainage, where the road's going to be, where the traffic's going to come in and out. So an engineer needs to design all that. Then you have an attorney to answer the legal questions. Now, for some, I've seen when I sat on BOZA, there was some non-controversial cases where an engineer did the whole presentation. An attorney was not used, but that's only in a non-controversial case. Is you just want to use an engineer. Then the architect is used to show the building, the elevations of the building, because the engineer just puts the footprint out so you can see it. Like if you're looking down on the site where the roadways are, where the building's going to be located and all that. But an architect could design a building and show the elevation so you can get a feel for what it's going to look like when it's developed. And that could certainly help your process if you have a great architect that makes a building look really good. So, and again, those fees are money well spent, because if you try to do it on your own, you would most likely fail. You don't know all the ins and the outs. You could ask or tell something that's totally irrelevant to the project that could hurt your cases of getting it zoned, and not answer the questions that need to be answered. So if you don't answer the questions that need to be answered, it'll probably be denied. You have to have a good plan to go in and anticipate all the questions that are going to be answered.
Definitely. No, I mean, seeking expert advice is extremely crucial when you're going through the process of rezoning. So when people look at a piece of property, generally speaking, if you're familiar with the zoning, how zoning works, you may know whether or not this piece of land will function for your use. But can you tell us a little bit about where you can identify whether where you can see where these uses are laid out? So is there like a...
Well, typically zoning takes place in areas that perhaps have changed over time. Think about, like Bardstown Road. Years and years ago, there were a lot of homes. It's like out in the Glenmary area, south of the Snyder Freeway and just north of the freeway. A lot of homes were right on Bardstown Road, because Bardstown Road at one time, I remember this, I'll tell you my age, because I lived in that area, and the road was 2 lanes, one going north and one going south. And then I was a young child, they expanded it, and then they expanded it again. But at one time, people would pull off of Bardstown Road right into their driveway. Well, the traffic increased and increased and increased over time. The Jefferson or the Snyder Freeway was built. And, you know, so changes. Whenever you get a change in an area, typically due to traffic, then the nature changes. You know, how could you imagine a single family house being on Bardstown Road that's now 6 or 7 lanes wide with the turn lane? So it'd be hard to back out of your driveway. So that the nature changes, so it's good for redevelopment. And when there's a lot of people in the area, you need services. It's typically retail services. Sometimes it's industrial. So certain areas are ripe for industrial development. A big area is chosen. It's out of the way. It's away from houses, but it's got a lot of road infrastructure. So this area, somebody might look at it and say, this is great for industrial development, just like Blankenbaker Station or East Point. Those are, you know, more of a planned development for industry, and they have regulations on what the buildings need to look like. There's other industrial areas in town like Riverport, planned specifically for manufacturing, distribution. So anyway, different areas of town lend themselves to different things. Certainly you wouldn't go in the middle of a subdivision and say, oh, I'd like this to be industrial. I'm going to buy up all these houses. I mean, it wouldn't make economic sense. If you have a nice subdivision to tear down a lot of nice houses to do that. But the airport needed to expand years ago, and there were a lot of houses all around the airport, and they were hamstrung. They could not expand the airport, and UPS came to town. So that's a big economic driver in our town is UPS. So the city took it upon themselves to buy up the neighborhoods. They bought whole neighborhoods, and they built new neighborhoods so people would get paid for their house and then can buy a house in a new neighborhood. So anyway, so things like that happen. Times change, and the nature of the neighborhood or the area changes. So then it's, when that happens, then it's ripe for another use. And then that's when the zoning process comes in.
That's awesome. So as far as the different types of zoning, are prices dictated based on what type of zoning it is? And can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, typically, I'm going to talk pre-COVID because we don't know the full effects of COVID yet. But I think this will hold true even after COVID, after we give it a chance to work its way out and we get a vaccine and all that. But typically, the highest prices for property are retail, because retail is driven by traffic. So the higher visibility, the more traffic, the more sales, the higher you can pay for a property. Now, there's also in downtown Louisville, Central Business District, there's other factors. Might not be retail, but it could be an arena that everybody wants. So you're going to pay top dollar to have the exact location that you want next to the river, looking at the city. So again, top dollar for that, top dollar for retail. The lesser prices would be for like large tracts of land for a subdivision. Industrial property is typically less, but again, it depends. I could say the general, if you were going to put a blanket over it, the highest price you're going to pay is a retail. For retail use, because if one has high traffic, great access to get in and out of the property, easy access to get in and out of the property, and high traffic and great visibility, that's going to draw a lot of people there. And if a lot of people are drawn to a certain area, then the sales are higher, and if the sales are higher, you can pay more, okay, for the land and do your development. So then it would go down from there, from retail. Sometimes industrial property and price and housing, tracts for housing are priced similarly, but obviously you're not going to put an industrial tract inside a tract that's already subdivision, and you would never want to put a subdivision inside a tract that's industrial. They're not compatible. The other thing about zoning that should be noted is, and this is in the regs, that wherever property is zoned, there is a graduation of uses. Like if you have a single family housing use, then maybe next to that could be a multifamily housing use, and next to that maybe an office use, and next to that maybe a retail use, and next to that maybe an industrial use. So it's a gradual change of use that is not too different from what's there, but it's more compatible. Just think of, you're living in a house and you have an industrial plant right next to you. That wouldn't be too good. But if you're living in a house and you have a multifamily house next to you, that's not bad. It's still somebody living there. Then multifamily might be next to an office, and then the office might be next to a retail. Then retail might be next to an industrial. So there's these gradual uses, and that's designed by plan. There's also rural use, like agricultural use or rural residential, where it's more of a land type that's more of a natural setting that fits the area better. That you wouldn't have necessarily an office setting in a bucolic rural setting necessarily. And offices have to be near services too. So you got to think about the whole process. But the real reason zoning was established is to maintain property values. If you bought a big, beautiful house on a nice piece of land, you're zoned a certain way, and you don't want an industrial plant coming next to you, typically. So that's why the zoning process is arduous and tedious a lot of times. So everybody has a chance to comment, and we make daggone sure that the use of the land is compatible with the surroundings, and it's just a better method. So it takes a while. That's by design, and they have these layers of uses that are compatible to the land, and that keeps the values high. Because if you're, just think if you're in a house, you'd want the house, the person next to you to have a house and not necessarily an industrial plant.
No, that's great. Some great information. So just to go back a little bit, so we've kind of explained how to go through the commercial zoning process. We've talked about the different uses of zoning, and we've also talked about how zoning affects property values. Now, in your specific case, you were on the BOZA board. Right. So what was your role on the BOZA board, and how does it affect, I guess, the zoning?
Okay. BOZA stands for Board of Zoning Adjustment. So there are certain characters in the zoning process where there might be rules and regulations saying that, okay, if you are a retail property and you're butted up against an office property, there's a certain setback. So if there's two office properties, the setback might be 10 feet on each property. So it's 20 feet between buildings. But if you're an office butting up against retail, the retail might need to be set back 30 feet or 20 feet versus just 10 feet. So they usually, the difference when you go from one zoning to the next, the zoning that's more obnoxious in the view of the board has to have a further setback. All right. So there are setbacks, there are other regulations, there are all these technical details. Like nowadays, they want connectivity. So if you're going to build a retail center on a busy highway, the planning commission wants there to be some connectivity between you and the neighbors. So somebody doesn't have to pull out on the road, go down 10 feet and pull back into the property. So they will force you to connect your parking lot to the next parking lot on the interior versus getting on the road and driving. So that's a regulation. They also have sidewalk regulations. They want people to walk more, or they want people to be able to walk from place to place. So there's sidewalks. So the Board of Zoning Adjustment takes care of variances, takes care of waivers, and also takes care of conditional use permits. I'm going to give you an example of each one. a variance. When I first indicated, maybe there is a 20-foot setback requirement for the building, but because of different zoning types. So in order to get your plan to work and to make it economically feasible, you say, I can't live with a 20-foot setback. I need a 10-foot setback. And maybe, you know, the Board of Zoning Adjustment will look at that and see if your justification is good enough. Now, it could be you could own property that's maybe zoned retail and maybe zoned for office, and there's a requirement that the setbacks be different for those retail and office, but you're going to put office on all of it, and you own both properties. So why do you even have to comply with that setback? So you say, hey, I own both of them. I don't care. I'm building office on both. So you would probably get a variance, and they would allow you to move it from 20 to 10. The waiver, the most memorable, well, there's all kinds of waivers, but one of them that sticks in my mind is there was a property being constructed, and in front of the property, there was a requirement for a sidewalk, but the sidewalk would have gone right to an expressway. And nobody's going to walk across the expressway or walk on the expressway. So why do you need a sidewalk that dead ends to an expressway? So they asked for a waiver of that requirement. And so it was just eliminated. It was a waiver. So a variance means changing the requirement to some other degree. A waiver means getting rid of it altogether. The next one is the conditional use permit. The most notable conditional use permits are like a restaurant can be in a C1 zoning, but not with the C1 zoning serve alcohol outdoors. They can serve alcohol indoors, but not have outdoor alcohol sales. So if that restaurant would apply and get a conditional use permit for outdoor alcohol sales, it could do it within a C1 zoning. It really takes a C2 zoning, which is a step higher than C1, to have that automatically granted. Same way like self-storage. Self-storage is in like M1, M2, PEC, but you could also put self-storage in C2 zoning with a conditional use permit. So it's another layer of protection that you would have to come through the board, have a public hearing, let people see what you want to do, and then it may or may not be granted. But that's what a conditional use permit is. So there's three things that we generally handle on the Board of Zoning Adjustment: variances, waivers, and conditional use permits.
Awesome. And I will clarify for the audience, the zoning types that he referenced are Jefferson County zoning, correct?
That is true. Yeah, every municipality has their different zoning. Some are B1, B2 for business. In Louisville, it's known as C1, C2. It's commercial. Basically means the same thing, but you got to know the area that you're in. Every county has its different language.
Definitely. I just wanted to make the clarification, but I will say, so one question that I had for you is, when would this route be better than completely rezoning the property? So for example, if you're a restaurant owner and you want to serve alcohol outside, would it behoove you to just change to C2, for example, or would it be just better for you?
Well, it's certainly much easier to get a conditional use permit than it is to go through the rezoning. It's a lot shorter process. BOZA, you would file your plan with BOZA. Notices would be sent out. You do not have to have neighborhood meetings for a BOZA application, and there is a public hearing, but the decision by BOZA doesn't have to go to Metro Council to get voted on. Once a decision is made, it's final. Now, it's still subject to a lawsuit if somebody wanted to contest it for whatever reason, but it's a lot shorter process. So typically, you can get a conditional use permit for your property. It's a lot less expensive, a lot less time consuming to get a conditional use permit than it is to go through a full zoning process. Awesome. Good question.
Yeah, it's just important to make that clarification, but awesome. Yeah. So, I mean, I think we've learned a ton about the zoning process, in particular here in Louisville, Kentucky. But as far as maybe, could you provide 3 pieces of advice that you would give someone about taking on the process of rezoning a property? Let's say they want to buy a piece of land and they're really interested in developing it to fit a certain use, but they need to go through that process. Can you provide some, maybe 3 pieces of advice?
Well, the three most important pieces of advice I could give someone is, number one, be patient. It takes time. You got to be patient. Number two, you got to have enough money to get through the process. And number three, hire the right experts, architects, engineers, attorneys to walk through the process. Especially if it's a controversial zoning. You will never get it done on your own. You just cannot know enough by yourself to get it done. You have to have the experts to do it. So time and patience, that's the same element. Time and patience, money and experts.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Paul. That's really great information. So, well, we'll go ahead and what we'll go ahead and do now is we'll open it up for questions. I am here on Facebook as well. So if you guys that are watching on Facebook feel like you have a question regarding the commercial zoning process, we'll give you a minute or two to provide some feedback. So anyone here as well on Zoom, if you have any questions, or maybe you have any projects you're working on that you have a question about, feel free to respond.
I would like to comment. I think you asked some very good questions. Get to the bottom line, Raphael. So you did a great job of identifying the areas of most importance in the whole process and to ask really good questions. And thanks for clapping, Renee. I see that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel, and this is something that I'm relatively new to as well. I mean, I haven't really gone through the rezoning process, but it is one of those things that is so integral to the growth of a city. So being able to understand it and being able to walk through the process is crucial, especially if you're going to be one of those people that want to get out there and provide new developments. So we have one new question. Keith, hey Keith, how's it going? Paul, he's asking, are there any books, articles, or resources that you recommend for a broker to have an understanding of the zoning process itself? I mean, it is very regionally specific, but do you have any?
Right. You know, that's a great question. I've never even thought about that. There is for Louisville Metro, Jefferson County, and for all the counties in Kentucky, if you go to the website of the county, it usually has the documents needed. Like we subscribe to Jefferson County, Bullitt County, Oldham County, Nelson County, et cetera. And we can get right into, and the different counties have different degrees of sophistication too. Louisville's really good. And if you go to you could go to louisville.kentucky.gov or something. I don't know what it is, but all you have to do is Google Louisville Metro Planning and Zoning, or Planning and Design is better. Louisville Metro Planning and Design. And you'll get to the link, and then it shows the entire book, and it shows everything you need to know. Now, it's very technically oriented, probably meant for attorneys and engineers. But I have to admit, I've never read a book necessarily on zoning, and I bet somebody's got a book out there. So that's a great question, Keith. I wish I'd have anticipated it. So I don't know.
Definitely. And I think Keith, if I'm not mistaken, is tuning in from, is it Indy? I want to make sure. So, but in your case, if you're tuning in, not in Louisville specifically, check out the Metro website for your corresponding place and see if they have it. And most metro cities are going to have their code. So Milwaukee. Awesome. So yeah, you're tuning in from Milwaukee. So Metro, check out the Milwaukee Metro government website. They should have some sort of zoning code available. And I even give a call to the Metro, someone at the Metro government, to see if they can provide you with any resources. I think that'd be great.
Here, Raphael, I did write down the link. This instead of Googling it, if somebody wants to go right to the zoning, it's louisville.gov/government/planning-design. So it's louisville.gov/government/planning-design. And that'll take you to all the zoning regs.
Awesome. So Krista is tuning in on Facebook. Hey, Krista. So she was asking, is there a cost difference in the type of zoning change? So how does it?
Yes, that's a great question. The application fees to Louisville Metro are all the same. Well, I shouldn't say that. The application fees vary depending on the size of development. But obviously, if you're doing a 1 acre development versus a 500 acre development, you'd expect to pay more for the 500 acre development. Those are minuscule when you compare those to the legal fees, to the engineering fees, and to the architecture fees. And the reason the engineering and the legal fees could be various is the time. If you have a non-controversial zoning, you can get it done quickly and at low cost. If it's a long zoning, if it's very controversial, it's going to be drawn out. The legal team has to plan more. It's going to take more of their time. They have to have night meetings. They have to do a lot of documents. So again, the more difficult the zoning process is, the more it's going to cost, just because of the time involved and all the experts they have to put in it.
Definitely, for sure. So a question from Renee. She was asking, sometimes things around town seem pretty random. Do you have a brief history of the planning and zoning in Louisville? I mean, it's pretty high level, but maybe just provide your feedback on the history of Louisville and zoning.
Well, one thing that's interesting that most people probably don't know, way back in in the early 70s, there was a glitch and we had no zoning. I think in 72 or 73, our authority lapsed for 1 day. So if you were using a property for a certain use back in like 1972, and that 1 day that glitch happened, and now you're still using it today, you may not be zoned correctly, but you're okay. It's called grandfathered in or non-conforming use rights. You have non-conforming use rights to continue to use that property for as long as you want for the non-allowed use, because at one point in time we had no zoning. So anything went. So you could have an industrial property in the middle of a neighborhood and you can continue to use it to this day as long as it's continuous. Now, if you stop using it and it stopped for a certain period of time, there's some other technicality which I'm not going to get into, but basically, if you've changed the use, say you were using it for a little industrial plant, you're in the middle of Old Louisville's a great example. Old Louisville has some M2 zone properties down in there in Old Louisville, where it's all the old houses, and there's M2 properties right up against these houses, and you can continue to use it. Now, if you change that M2 use and made a residential use out of it, or if you took a fourplex and converted it to a single family house and wanted to convert it back to a fourplex, you can't do that. If you had it as a fourplex and you continue to use it as a fourplex, you're grandfathered in, that's the common language, or non-conforming use rights you have to continue using it as a fourplex, even though you're surrounded by single family houses. So that's just a little quirk in our zoning code.
That's awesome. Yeah, I own a fourplex in Old Louisville, and that's the same thing that I was told. It said when you buy the property as a fourplex, you can keep it as a fourplex, but if you were to ever convert it back to a single family home, you cannot convert it back to a multifamily.
Right.
And another thing that I was kind of curious about, this is more of my question. So obviously different cities have different objectives when it comes to how they want to see the city grow, right? Mm-hmm. Just for example, in J-Town, they're making a big push along Taylorsville Road to essentially incentivize more retail and office and various other uses in that area. Can you maybe talk a little bit about why that would be the case?
Yes, that's a great question. J-Town, at one point, they had a lot of automotive uses along the main road, automotive spots and whatnot. And the city wants to make it more of an entertainment venue. So they want to encourage restaurants and bars and retail versus the automotive use. So they put a blanket zoning over that whole area that once, if there was an automotive use, that automotive use will be allowed to stay. But once it goes away, then it's going to revert back to the new zoning, which is CTC, I think, CTC Center Town or something like. I can't even think of what it's called.
City Town Center. City Town Center, I think is what it's
called.
City
Town Center. There you go. City Town Center. But the city does this to enhance the beauty, because a restaurant or a bar or some type of entertainment venue will bring people to the city all times during the day, where a car lot maybe have more of a negative view. It doesn't look as nice as maybe a nice retail establishment. So cities also do the other thing. They blanket zone industrial. J-Town's done this before. They've taken a large swath of property near the industrial park and put a blanket industrial zoning on it. So the people that were living there could stay there. Once they move out, though, and stop using it for a home, they could, and it also enhances the value, because they can probably get more for an industrial use from what they paid for the house years and years and years ago. So they've done it in an area where the houses are older and not worth as much. They wouldn't do it to a new subdivision that the houses are priced too much, because you couldn't get your value out of it.
Definitely. I appreciate
And this
that.
is done in a lot of municipalities, not just J-Town, but it's done other places too. Like the city of Louisville has a waterfront district, and they have CBD, central business district, and different zonings. Like, you don't see a 30-story building out in the suburbs because it won't allow it. But downtown in the central business district, they have C3 zoning, which will allow skyscrapers, but they don't have that out in the suburbs.
Okay, awesome. All right. So I was wondering, do we have any more questions for Paul related to the zoning process? Going once?
Yeah, Paul, this is Barry in Purefoy. What's your take on the Nulu area?
Nulu?
Yes.
Well, I remember Nulu as a kid, believe it or not. My dad used to have a restaurant downtown Louisville, and Market Street was exactly that. It was a market. You had a fish market, you had a fruit market, you had, well, there was a stock market that was a little bit away from that. But after a while, every area changes, like we discussed earlier. Changes happen. That area became really depressed, and those buildings were, the people in them moved out. They moved out east, or they moved other places, and the buildings were used for various uses. And then over time, people thought, the buildings may not look good, but this area is a great area. It's close to downtown Louisville. It's just a little bit east of the central business district. So there was a push to renovate. So the market values have really gone up there in the last 10 years, because somebody had the vision and the idea. And that's exactly what is happening in the Portland area of Louisville now, way in the West End where the falls were. That was the original, Louisville. That was a thriving, and it's a Portland. That's where the port was. That's where the ships came, or not the ships, but the boats. So there was a huge community down there. And over time, every community changes. These beautiful homes, the nature changes over time. There's some, they let them run down, but now there's a revitalization. But to get back to your point of the Nulu, that's exactly what it is. They're revising the market area of Louisville, New Louisville. So that there's quite a revitalization going on down there, and it's a great location. So that's, location's everything. Everybody knows in real estate, location's everything. So it was depressed for a while, and now it's roaring back. And there was also along Liberty Street, there was a lot of housing that there's always a catalyst, everything in zoning. Louisville, the hospital and the medical community really invested in downtown Louisville, but there wasn't any place for the doctors and the ancillary personnel to live down there. So Louisville bought up a lot of old housing at a low rate, and they built these beautiful new complexes so they could have the young professionals, or professionals, they don't necessarily have to be young, but that's typically what they are, to move into the housing, because the housing is all new. Nobody wanted to live in the old housing that was there. So things change over time and things get redeveloped. And I think, you know, if you don't keep up with the maintenance on a property, as it goes down, it'll lose value. When it loses value, then it's time to tear it down and start over or revise it. So, but New Lou's a great area of town in my estimation.
Awesome. Great answer. So Renee, we'll do one more question just because we're kind of running up on time, but this question comes from Renee, and she says, do you happen to know if planning and zoning has been plagued by issues similar to redlining?
Not to my knowledge. Yeah, I don't know of any issues that have ever come to light in my knowledge for, you know, redlining. You know, I don't know.
Definitely.
Don't know about it.
Cool. Oh, any other questions that we have? All right. Well, I just want to thank everyone for coming by. I mean, I think we learned a ton of great information about the commercial zoning process. Thanks again, Paul, for agreeing to speak and provide some knowledge. Obviously, you're probably one of the foremost experts in the city in reality on this process. So I really think that you provided some great insight, and this will be recorded as well. So for those of you who are wanting to rewatch this at a later date, I will be providing the video content as well. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you guys in a few weeks.
Thank you, Raphael. Thanks for having me.